The Wendigo, a mythological cannibalistic monster in the spiritual tradition of North American Algonquian-speaking tribes. It is associated with winter and described as either a fearsome beast that stalks and eats humans, or as a spirit that possesses humans, causing them to turn into cannibals. Some legends say the Wendigo is an emaciated figure with ashen flesh. Others describe it as a giant creature up to 15 feet tall, or as a beast that grows larger the more it eats. It may have sunken or glowing eyes and sharp yellowed fangs and claws. Its lips are chewed or entirely missing because it has eaten them. It may be hairless or have fur, and it may have pointed ears and horns or antlers like a deer. It smells of rotting flesh, and is usually first detected by humans by its horrible odour. Wendigos are believed to have exceptionally sharp eyesight, hearing, and sense of smell, as well as superior strength and speed in order to stalk and overpower their victims. They live in colder climates among the woodlands and lakes of Canada and the northern United States. They can move easily through deep snow and across ice. A shaman may be the only person who can subdue and destroy a Wendigo, using either a silver, steel, or iron bullet or a dagger. Some legends, however, claim the Wendigo's heart must be cut out and melted or burned in a fire before its spirit is truly vanquished. The Wendigo is sometimes described as a spirit rather than a physical presence. In Cree mythology, for example, the Wendigo is believed to be an evil spirit that possesses humans. The spirit enters a person by biting him or her or through a dream. The possessed person becomes cannibalistic or otherwise deranged or violent. Some people are believed to be more susceptible to becoming possessed by a Wendigo, including those who are greedy or gluttonous, as well as those who are suffering from hunger or starvation. Swift Runner was a Cree Indian who lived during the last century in what is now central Alberta. His background seemed not unusual. As a young man, he received a solid, useful Cree education. He married and had a family of 6 children. He traded with the Hudson's Bay Company, and in 1875 he served as a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police. But Swift Runner's life ended in tragedy and notoriety. During the winter of 1878-79, a time of starvation and misery for the Cree people, he became possessed by the Wendigo psychosis, an aberration characterized by grand delusions and cannibalistic impulses that anthropologists have identified in several Canadian Indian cultures. He murdered his wife and family and cooked and ate their flesh. Eventually he was arrested, brought to trial, and in December 1879, hanged at Fort Saskatchewan. January 27, 2010, Wendigo N, a spirit believed by the Algonquians, Cree, and Ojibwas to take possession of vulnerable people, causing them to engage in cannibalism and other forms of antisocial behaviour. I've always had a soft spot for Westerns, and during the late 1980s I went through a phase of writing Western stories, primarily for the magazines of the now-defunct Western publications in Stillwater, Oklahoma. While researching a major series for True West called Grandmother's Land Sitting Bull in Canada, I stumbled into this, tasty little story somewhere in the Mounted Police reports. When the story ran in the Quarterly Old West, I accompanied it with an image from the collection of the Glenbow Museum. It showed Swift Runner with a scowling Mountie in pillbox hat. I've always found this photo of Swift Runner unsettling. Approaching it in the nature of protagonist Alan Grant in The Daughter of Time, by Josephine Tay, disregarding the massive shackles and the knowledge of his horrific crime, and assuming innocence, I think I might have drawn an alarming conclusion. He had a pleasant face, making me think that he was someone who loved to laugh. I would likely have passed a pleasant moment chatting had I run into him on the street. Wendigo, first published in Old West summer 1990. During the winter, a Wendigo ate Swift Runner's family. Swift Runner was a Cree hunter and trapper from the country north of Fort Edmonton. He was a big man over 6 feet tall and well-liked. He was mild and trustworthy, a considerate husband, and very fond of his children, a little too fond of his children, as events proved. All of these traits endeared him to his people and to the traders of the Hudson's Bay Company. But this was not enough to allay suspicion when he returned from his winter camp in the spring of 1879 without his wife and family. When he could not give a satisfactory account of their whereabouts, his in-laws became worried. They decided to tell the Northwest Mounted Police, who had then been in the West for just 5 years. Inspector Sévère Gagnon was given the task of investigating Swift Runner's behaviour. He and a small party of policemen accordingly trekked out to the trapper's camp. Swift Runner obligingly showed the mounted policeman a small grave near his camp. He explained that one of his boys had died and was buried there. Gagnon and his detachment opened the grave and found the bones undisturbed. That, however, did not explain the human bones scattered around the encampment. Gagnon produced a skull, which Swift Runner willingly told him was that of his wife. Without much prodding, Swift Runner revealed what had happened to the rest of his family. At first, Swift Runner became haunted by dreams. A Wendigo spirit called on him to consume the people around him. The spirit crept through his mind, gradually taking control. Finally, he was Wendigo, and Swift Runner no longer. Then, the Wendigo killed and ate Swift Runner's wife. This accomplished, the Wendigo forced one of Swift Runner's boys to kill and butcher his younger brother. While enjoying this grisly repast, the spirit hung Swift Runner's infant by the neck from a lodgepole and tugged at the baby's dangling feet. It was later shown that he had also done away with Swift Runner's brother and his mother-in-law, though he acknowledged that she had been a bit tough. The revolted mounted police party hauled Swift Runner and the mutilated evidence back to Fort Saskatchewan. The trial began on August 8, 1879. The judge and jury did not view the Wendigo idea in the same light as the Cree. They saw Swift Runner as a murderer, and the trapper made no attempt to hide his guilt. Stipendiary Magistrate Richardson quickly sentenced him to be hanged. The sentence presented a problem. The police had never before conducted an execution. Although the Hudson's Bay Company had once hanged an employee for murder, this was, for all intents and purposes, the first formal execution in Western Canada. Staff Sergeant Fred Bagley, a force bugler, was put in charge of the arrangements. A gallows was erected within the fort enclosure at Fort Saskatchewan, and an old army pensioner named Rogers was made hangman. On the appointed morning, a bitterly cold December 20th, Swift Runner was led to the scaffold. Standing over the trap, the unrepentant cannibal was given the opportunity to address the large crowd that had gathered. He openly acknowledged his guilt and thanked his jailers for their kindness, then berated his guard for making him wait in the cold. Nevertheless, the mounted police must have accomplished their first execution well enough. A more experienced spectator, a California 49er named Jim Reed, commented, "That's the purtiest hanging I ever seen, and it's the 29th. Nowadays we view as psychosis what the Cree thought to be the work of a Wendigo spirit. At one time, in the belt of parkland that borders the northern plains, it was far from being a rare phenomenon. Usually the symptoms were the same as those displayed by Swift Runner, and in one way or another, most of the afflicted Wendigos met similar violent death. Man convicted of killing and eating his family stayed calm despite delays and hitches in 1879 hanging." Jana G. Pruden, Edmonton Journal. Sunday, September 18, 2011. It was pitch black and brutally cold when Swift Runner was led from his cell at Fort Saskatchewan jail to start his long last walk toward the gallows that awaited outside in the swirling snow. Swift Runner, or Karkisi Kuchin, had been told to prepare for death and seemed to have heeded the advice. He walked confidently into the yard, seeming much calmer than many of those who were there to watch him die. Most of the 60 people gathered near the gallows had never seen a hanging, and they were nervous and anxious about what was going to happen. Sheriff Edward Richard had been delayed by the snow and weather and was flustered by his late arrival at the fort. The hangman, too, appeared nervous. The execution had been ordered to take place at 7:30 a.m. on December 20, 1879. With less than half an hour left to go, it was discovered that the crowd had taken the trap from the gallows and burned it as kindling, that the hangman had forgotten to bring straps to bind the prisoner's arms. As the sheriff and hangman rushed to get the scaffold ready again, Swift Runner sat near one of the fires that had been lighted nearby, joking and chatting, snacking on pemmican, the thick noose hanging loose around his neck. "I could kill myself with a tomahawk," he offered, "and save the hangman further trouble." Swift Runner was well known around the Fort Saskatchewan settlement, a striking 6'3", with a strapping build and what one policeman called as ugly and evil-looking a face as I have ever seen. He had once been known as smart and trustworthy, a reputation that won him a job as a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police. But, as one newspaper story would later point out, his contact with white men, however, ruined him. That ruination came, in part, from an inordinate fondness for the whiskey that was smuggled into the area disguised as medicine. Swift Runner was known to be an ugly customer to meet when on a spree, so ugly that some called him the terror of the whole region. The police sent Swift Runner back to his tribe, where he caused so much trouble, he turned the Cree camps into little hells, and was eventually turned out from his community altogether, retreating to the wilderness with his wife, mother, brother, and 6 children. The police started to hear stories in the spring. A Cree chief said Swift Runner had turned cannibal, and a hunter reported that Swift Runner's entire family had been killed in the woods. But a squad of officers who went out to investigate couldn't find Swift Runner or his family. Instead, Swift Runner went to the police himself in the spring, telling them his wife had committed suicide and the rest of the family had died of starvation. But the officers noticed that Swift Runner didn't look underfed. The prisoner arrived at our camp in the spring and did not look very poor or thin, or as if he had been starving, one noted. Suspicious of the story, police travelled with Swift Runner to his family's camp in the wilderness north of Fort Saskatchewan. After days of searching, they found the remnants of a campfire, with piles of bones and human skulls scattered nearby. Some of the bones were dry and hollow, empty even of marrow. A small moccasin had been stuffed inside the skull of Swift Runner's mother, a beading needle still sticking out of the unfinished work. Swift Runner was tried for murder and cannibalism by a jury that included 3 English-speaking Cree half-breeds, 4 men well up in the Cree language, and a Cree man who translated the proceedings. A leading Cree English scholar was also brought in to observe the trial and ensure Swift Runner knew what was being said. Swift Runner sat calmly throughout the testimony of witnesses, who described the family being in perfect health when they headed out to the woods, then Swift Runner coming out of the forest alone. "He said I could not expect to see any of his family because he was the only one left," said Kissikome. There was no evidence presented in Swift Runner's defence. Asked if he wanted to say anything, he responded, "I did it." The death sentence was to be the first legal hanging in the Canadian Northwest Territories, an area that includes what is now the province of Alberta. A scaffold was built especially for the execution, and an army pensioner was paid $50 to serve as hangman. Swift Runner declined to spend the night before his execution with a priest. "The white man has ruined me," he said. "I don't think their god could amount to much." Some said Swift Runner had developed a taste for cannibalism years earlier, when he was forced to eat the remains of a starved hunting partner to save himself. Others said he had been possessed by the Wendigo, a flesh-eating spirit that tormented him and gave him nightmares. 2 hours after Swift Runner was led to the gallows, the execution was finally ready to proceed. He was allowed to eat 1 final pound of pemmican before he was pinioned tightly with rope and taken to the scaffold, where a thick, black hood was placed over his head. The trap fell, and Swift Runner went down with fearful force, there being a drop of 5 feet, the Daily Evening Mercury reported. He died without a struggle. The body was cut down in an hour and buried in the snow outside the fort. Sheriff Edward Richard said those who attended the hanging were satisfied with what they saw, seeing that the Indians are averse to hanging and that all sorts of rumours were afloat amongst them and half-breeds about deeds of cruelty that were to accompany the execution. Invitations had been tendered to Indian chiefs to assist at the execution, he wrote in a report to the government. Some of them responded to the invitation and declared that it was done in such a way that they could no more object to that mode of execution. One witness, who had watched several other executions in the United States, also seemed pleased with the spectacle, slapping his thigh and saying, "Boys, it was the prettiest hanging I ever seen." The haunting case of Jack Fiddler, slayer of Wendigos. In the vast, unforgiving wilderness of northern Ontario, where the winters stretched endlessly and the forests grew thick and impenetrable, lived a man whose name would echo through history, Jack Fiddler. His name would be whispered in fear and reverence, for he was no ordinary man. Fiddler was a Cree shaman, a spiritual leader of his people, the sucker clan of the Ojibwe, but his legacy was darker, stranger, and more terrifying than most could imagine. Jack Fiddler was not just a healer or a wise man. He was known as a slayer of Wendigos, terrifying, supernatural creatures whose hunger for human flesh could not be sated. To understand the gravity of Jack Fiddler's actions, one must first understand the Wendigo itself. The Wendigo is a being from Algonquian folklore, a spirit born out of the cold, desolate winters of the northern forests. It was said that in times of extreme hunger, when the land offered no food and people were on the verge of starvation, a dark transformation could take place. If someone succumbed to the despair and desperation of hunger, they could be possessed by a Wendigo. The creature was the embodiment of greed and cannibalism, a once human figure turned into a monster, emaciated and skeletal, with ice-blue skin stretched tightly over its bones, lips blackened from frostbite, and eyes sunken deep into their sockets. The Wendigo was forever starving, forever ravenous, and it would stop at nothing to consume human flesh. The Cree people believed in the Wendigo not as a myth, but as a real and tangible threat. This belief was not just about the fear of supernatural creatures, but also a warning about the dangers of losing one's humanity in times of crisis. In their worldview, anyone could become a Wendigo if they gave in to the primal instinct of survival at the cost of others, especially through the act of cannibalism. And once someone began to transform, they were already lost. Jack Fiddler was born into this world, a place where the Wendigo's presence loomed large, especially during the long, brutal winters when survival became a test of endurance and faith. Fiddler had been trained as a Midewiwin, a spiritual leader, by the elders of his community. He learned the sacred rituals, the songs, and the ways to communicate with the spirits. But Fiddler's path would take a darker turn as he was called upon time and again to do what no one else could: destroy those who had succumbed to the Wendigo. His first encounter with a Wendigo came early in his life. A young woman in his village had fallen ill. She had been a healthy and strong member of the community, but as the harsh winter dragged on and food became scarce, something in her began to change. Her family noticed that she no longer looked at them with love or familiarity, but with hunger. Her body began to waste away, her skin clung tightly to her bones, and she stopped speaking in coherent words. Instead, she growled and snarled, muttering in a strange, guttural voice. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, became hollow, empty, and terrifying. The village elders recognized the signs. The woman was turning into a Wendigo. In desperation, they turned to Jack Fiddler. He was still young then, but his reputation as a powerful shaman had already begun to grow. Fiddler knew the ritual. He knew that if the woman fully transformed into a Wendigo, she would slaughter her own family, and worse, her hunger for flesh would never be satisfied. To prevent this, Fiddler made the painful decision that she must die before the transformation was complete. In the dark of night, Fiddler performed the necessary rituals, praying to the spirits for guidance, asking for the strength to carry out what had to be done. The village watched in silence as he approached the woman, now a shell of her former self. She was no longer recognizable. Her mouth hung open in a grotesque smile, her teeth bared like an animal's. Fiddler, with great sorrow and resolve, killed her quickly, knowing it was the only way to save her soul and protect the rest of the village. Her body was burned to ashes, the only way to ensure that the Wendigo spirit could not escape and possess another. This was the first of many times that Jack Fiddler would be called upon to kill a Wendigo. For decades, Fiddler acted as the protector of his people, called upon whenever there were signs of Wendigo possession. His fame grew not just within his own village but across the entire region. Stories of his bravery and power spread. He was said to have killed 14 Wendigos throughout his lifetime, though some accounts suggest the number may have been even higher. Fiddler never acted without the community's agreement. He performed the necessary rituals, consulted with the spirits, and only acted when it was clear that someone had truly fallen to the Wendigo's curse. But not every case was the same. Some Wendigos were far more dangerous and cunning. One such case occurred in the winter of 1896, a year that the Cree people remembered as one of the coldest and most unforgiving they had ever faced. A man from a neighbouring tribe had gone missing after venturing out into the woods in search of food. Weeks later he returned, but something about him had changed. He had a wild look in his eyes, his clothes were torn, and his skin was frostbitten in several places. He refused to speak of what had happened in the forest, but the village noticed something strange. He was always hungry. At first, they thought nothing of it. After all, the man had been lost in the wilderness for weeks and had likely survived on little more than snow and bark. But his hunger grew worse. He ate constantly, consuming everything that was given to him, yet he remained gaunt and hollow-looking. The villagers became frightened when small animals began to disappear. Eventually, they found the remains of a dog that had been ripped apart and eaten, and they knew. The man had become a Wendigo. Jack Fiddler was called once again. When he arrived, he could sense the evil in the man. He performed a ceremony to try and cleanse the Wendigo spirit from him, but it was too late. The man had already crossed the threshold. Fiddler knew what had to be done, but the man fought back, his strength unnaturally great for someone so emaciated. It took Fiddler and several others to restrain him, and finally, Fiddler put an end to the man's suffering. As always, the body was burned to prevent the Wendigo spirit from moving on. Fiddler's role as a Wendigo slayer was not without controversy. His actions, though seen as necessary by his people, were viewed with suspicion and horror by outsiders. By the early 1900s, Canada was exerting more control over Indigenous lands, and the authorities were becoming increasingly involved in Indigenous affairs. The government's legal system was not equipped to understand the cultural and spiritual practices of the Cree. To them, Fiddler's killings were acts of murder, plain and simple. In 1907, Jack Fiddler and his brother Joseph were arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police after a woman in their village was killed to prevent her from becoming a Wendigo. The arrest was a devastating blow to the Cree community. The Mounties, unfamiliar with the cultural beliefs surrounding the Wendigo, saw only a crime, not an act of protection. Jack Fiddler was an old man by this time, and his reputation as a healer and shaman counted for nothing in the eyes of the law. During his trial, Fiddler explained his actions, but the court was not swayed. To them, the idea of a supernatural creature influencing human behaviour was absurd. Fiddler's cultural defence fell on deaf ears. As the trial dragged on, Fiddler, now in his 70s, grew more despondent. One night, he took matters in the small, cramped jail cell where he was being held. Jack Fiddler hanged himself, unwilling to face a future in which his life's work had been misunderstood and condemned. His brother Joseph was found guilty of murder, despite the pleas from his community and others who understood the cultural significance of the Wendigo belief. Joseph was sentenced to life in prison, though he would later receive a pardon after serving several years. By then, it was too late. He had died in custody, his body and spirit broken. The legacy of Jack Fiddler endures, shrouded in mystery and tragedy. To his people, he was a hero, a man who had saved them from a fate worse than death. To the Canadian authorities, he was a criminal. His story is a haunting reminder of the collision between cultures and the devastating consequences when one worldview is imposed upon another. The Wendigo, a creature of legend, continues to stalk the edges of folklore, a symbol of hunger, madness, and the darkness that lies within us all. And Jack Fiddler, the Wendigo slayer, remains a figure of both fear and reverence, a man who walked the line between the human and the monstrous, battling the demons that lurked in the frozen woods.